This is our photo essay, and this is called A Disposable Workforce, the Injustice Migrant Workers Face in Canada. And this is by Ronki Adaripici, Neil Constantino, Crystal Frechette, Judy Friesen, Tiana Thompson, and Kaylee Urbano. Migrant workers are a large workforce that come to Canada in hopes of making a better life for their loved ones back home. These seasonal workers, upon arrival, have to navigate language barriers with limited knowledge of their rights and entitlements as workers in Canada and limited understanding of how the health and legal systems work. The social determinants of health play directly into their state of well-being and personhood, as they are reliant on their sponsor for everything from access to healthcare to living conditions. They are a vulnerable population that nurses can be impactful on improving well-being. If proactive measures are taken to ensure things like nutrition, sleep, and early access to health, this would level some of their health inequalities. Unfortunately, there are situations when there is power disparity and racism when employers enforce restrictions such as long hours and low wages, which create further inequalities, making access to healthcare difficult and therefore prevention of illness difficult.
Migrant workers have to make the difficult decision to leave home for various reasons, such as making a living for their families, security, and opportunity. Canada receives about 50,000 workers annually from foreign countries to work in various sectors, especially in the agriculture industry. Noteworthy, these migrant workers contribute immensely to Canada's economy and the overall welfare of this nation's population. Despite the contribution of migrant workers to the Canadian economy, employers subject them to poor working conditions and violation of human rights. For instance, migrant workers only have access to short-term visas often attached to specific employers. The permits that bind migrant workers to particular employers make them vulnerable to abuse by such employers, since they lack the freedom to engage with other employers. In this regard, employers can overexploit and abuse employees through poor working conditions and unfair compensation since migrant workers fear losing their immigration status. Migrants often go through bureaucratic procedures and requirements to work or practice in a new country. This includes the process of registration and obtaining identification numbers. These migrants are on temporary migration rather than permanent migration, meaning that they work only on a temporary basis, with fewer rights, limited access to services, and no access to federally funded settlement services. Migrants need to integrate into the new country of relocation. Assimilating will entail a process of gradual adjustment to the new country of relocation without knowing anyone. Many hurdles are being faced, and language is almost always the first. Barriers go beyond language as migrants often struggle to understand how their new country works, including society's obvious rules and the unwritten customs and patterns of do's and don'ts. New migrants may often not know anyone or may depend on friends and neighbors to act as their guide. Canada's agriculture relies on the help from seasonal migrant workers every year to perform jobs that the sponsoring employer has demonstrated no Canadian is willing to do. Despite the unfair wages and exploitation that migrants experience from sponsored farmers, they return to Canada yearly for the prospect of job security and higher wages. The power imbalance between the farmer and the migrant worker puts them in a vulnerable position for abuse. Many workers experience unsafe working conditions, below minimal pay, and long hours of work demanded by the farmer because temporary workers do not have worker rights, making it lawful for the farmer to make his own rules. If the workers are found filing a complaint, the farmer can terminate their employment and deport them back home at any point in time. This creates a system based on fear and a lack of protection from migrant workers.
Most migrant workers that come to Canada are from Mexico and the Caribbean, of which are predominantly people of color. In Canada, specifically in Manitoba, BIPOC communities are more likely to live in low-income neighborhoods, to live in overcrowded and/or multi-generational households, to have low-wage occupations, and to be employed in higher-risk occupations. We can see that migrant workers are greatly affected by social determinants of health. This is because they are most often subject to rigorous work with low wages, which in turn affects their quality of life in terms of living conditions and access to health care. The combination of low wages and limited access to health care makes migrant workers susceptible to illness and other health risks. In addition, living in overcrowded homes is a risk factor for disease transmission, which is more prevalent now during the COVID-19 pandemic. Unlike workers who are citizens, migrant workers lack the support of government regulation. This allows farmers to take advantage of these workers, forcing many of them to work long hours for under minimum wage. Many of these workers also do not have health coverage provided to them by their employer, leaving them vulnerable to illnesses. With COVID-19, this is especially troubling, as although more cases of illness are occurring in these workers, they are receiving no extra help. Many are also afraid to take time off, as due to the lack of government regulation, their employer is able to let them go during their illness. This would in turn end their visa, forcing the migrant worker to go back home. These seasonal workers deserve the same rights as anyone else residing here. There is a role for nurses in health promotion for this community. Migrant workers are eligible for health cards as temporary workers, but are dependent on their employers to navigate the system. Health promotion strategies for nurses include making healthcare more accessible by promoting ideas such as mobile clinics and outreach sources. For example, recently there has been COVID vaccinations brought to the migrant workers in Ontario after several outbreaks. Nurses can encourage health promotion by firstly identifying those who may be vulnerable as a migrant worker. Secondly, they can provide translation if needed, and thirdly, respect their privacy and confidentiality. Nurses should not underestimate the impact they can have in determining the health and well-being of a migrant worker. The time and care one provides may mean the difference between prevention and management of disease or someone becoming very ill.
Public health policy and government enforcement could have profound effect on improving the quality of life for migrant workers in Canada. The government has granted health status to temporary workers but has not rolled out policy to solidify accessing health care. Recently, migrant support groups have formed to link workers to supports. Also, the Migrant and Seasonal Agriculture Worker Protection Act, MSPA, is there to protect workers' rights. There is a political push from advocates to give all migrant workers access to permanent resident status and to empower migrant workers to seek recourse for unjust treatment through access of information, services, and justice. These are large issues, and by bringing awareness, nurses can be impactful through advocacy, donation, and supporting the politicians that influence these issues. The migrant workers are essential to our agriculture needs in our society, and by supporting the policymakers, we can be participating in the fight to diminish health disparity. As Canadians, we have been fortunate that food insecurity has not been a national issue. This is due in a large effect to the thousands of seasonal migrant workers that leave their loved ones each year to work in our fields. This vulnerable migrant population, whose skills are deemed low, should be a valued part of our society, as their work is essential. As nurses, becoming a healthcare advocate is imperative to creating the changes we seek for justice, and for Canada to recognize the harms committed on migrant workers is a violation and a human rights issue. This is non-negotiable. Their skills, race, and background should not dictate maltreatment, nor does it indicate that temporary status is an opportunity to violate people. Stepping onto Canadian soil should ensure complete protection and care over migrant workers. Leaving loved ones is hard enough. Having to face unregulated work conditions and no access to health care jeopardizes their future, increases health risks, and adds to the trauma these workers face to provide for their families back home. Just as Lady Justice symbolizes fair and equal administration of the law without corruption, favor, greed, or prejudice, the migrant workers are important, indispensable contributors to our society who should be shielded by the same values and rights that Lady Justice speaks.